Cross Industries' portfolio is currently overvalued by 23% compared to its actual worth. The billionaire's mocking laughter died in his throat. The waitress he'd just humiliated had exposed his biggest secret to a room full of witnesses. Evelyn Harper stood perfectly still, coffee tray balanced, while Nathaniel Cross stared at her like she'd detonated a bomb. Expensive suits exchanged nervous glances. Powerful men weren't supposed to be exposed by coffee servers. But Evelyn had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years, and she was done being invisible. Hit subscribe. What happens next changes everything. Evelyn Harper placed the coffee cup down with practiced precision, but her eyes remained fixed on the conversation at table 7. Nathaniel Cross, the tech billionaire who'd just graced the Forbes cover, was laughing dismissively with his friends about the economic crisis that ordinary people couldn't possibly understand. "Hey, waitress," Nathaniel called out loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Want to give us some investment advice? I bet you understand the stock market better than Warren Buffett, right?" Evelyn stopped, turning to face him with an unsettling calm. "Do you actually want to hear it, or are you just looking for entertainment by putting someone down?" Nathaniel laughed harder. "Come on, surprise me. Cross Industries' portfolio is currently overvalued by 23% compared to its actual worth. You short-sold your own company's stock last week, which violates securities law. And if I'm not mistaken, the SEC will open an investigation within 72 hours. The room fell silent as death. If you've ever dealt with someone who thought they could walk over you just because they had money or a title, tell us where you're listening from, because what happened next changed everything. The expensive suits around table 7 exchanged uncomfortable glances, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips, while conversations throughout the cafe died mid-sentence as patrons turned to watch the drama unfold. Nathaniel's confident smirk flickered like a candle in the wind, replaced by the dawning understanding that he wasn't the smartest person in the room, a realization Evelyn had watched powerful men grapple with in boardrooms across Wall Street. Phones appeared discreetly, some recording, others texting urgent updates to friends who wouldn't believe what was happening at Meridian Cafe. "That's quite an accusation from someone serving coffee," Nathaniel said, but his voice had lost its earlier swagger. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered behind her dark eyes, the kind of look that comes from someone who's lost everything once and refuses to be intimidated again. "It's not an accusation," she replied, her voice steady as granite. "It's an observation based on publicly available SEC filings, your company's quarterly reports, and the unusual trading patterns that started appearing in Cross Industries stock exactly 9 days ago. The volume spike occurred precisely 48 hours after your private meeting with the Pentagon Procurement Committee, a meeting that, according to insider trading laws, should have triggered a mandatory disclosure period before any stock transactions." Old habits from her analyst days died hard, and the precision of her language carried the weight of someone who'd once commanded 7-figure deals. "But you already know that, don't you, Mr. Cross?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he processed not just what she'd said, but how she'd said it with the clinical accuracy of someone who'd spent years navigating the treacherous waters of high finance. Behind the espresso machine, her co-worker Miguel caught her eye with a worried expression, while the cafe's nervous manager Doug emerged from his hiding place in the back office, clearly unsure whether to intervene. But Nathaniel remained fixed in place, studying Evelyn with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex equation, his friends shifting uncomfortably as they realized their earlier amusement had transformed into something far more dangerous. After 2 years of perfecting invisibility while serving coffee to people who treated her like furniture and discussed deals she could analyze better than any of them, something inside her had finally snapped with the force of a breaking dam. "You seem to know an awful lot about securities law for a waitress," Nathaniel said slowly, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity, tinged with suspicion. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face, taking in details he'd missed before, the way she carried herself, the intelligence blazing behind her composed exterior, the subtle confidence that no amount of designer suits could buy. Evelyn set down her serving tray and met his gaze directly, unflinching. "Maybe you should ask yourself why someone with my knowledge is serving your coffee instead of sitting across from you in a boardroom." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and she could see the gears turning in Nathaniel's mind, trying to piece together the puzzle of who she really was. His friends had gone completely quiet now, sensing they'd witnessed something far more significant than a simple exchange between customer and server. "What's your name?" Nathaniel asked, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. For the first time since she'd started working at Meridian Cafe, someone was asking her name, not to summon her like a servant, but because they genuinely wanted to know who she was. "Evelyn Harper," she replied, and watched recognition flicker across his features, not full recognition, but the nagging sense that he'd heard that name before in a context that had nothing to do with coffee service. One of Nathaniel's companions, a silver-haired man Evelyn recognized as Marcus Whitfield, the hedge fund king, leaned forward with barely concealed interest. "Nathaniel, perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere," he murmured, but his eyes never left Evelyn's face. She could practically see him calculating, trying to determine if she was a threat to be eliminated or an asset to be acquired. The other men at the table were beginning to look uncomfortable, their earlier amusement replaced by the dawning realization that they might have witnessed something that could come back to bite them. In their world, information was currency, and this waitress had just demonstrated she possessed more valuable intelligence than most of their highly paid analysts. "Harper," Nathaniel repeated slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Evelyn Harper. I know I've heard that name before." His voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to having a perfect memory for names and faces, a necessary skill in his world of high-stakes deals and corporate maneuvering. Evelyn felt her chest tighten with a familiar mix of hope and dread as she realized she'd just shattered 2 years of carefully constructed anonymity and stood exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Recognition could mean vindication, but it could also mean exposure of wounds she wasn't ready to reopen. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of being overlooked and underestimated, she'd chosen this moment, this place, this particular arrogant billionaire to make her stand. "Perhaps you have," she said carefully, her professional mask sliding back into place. "The financial world isn't as large as people think." But as she looked at Nathaniel Cross, saw the genuine intrigue replacing his earlier condescension, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she'd chosen exactly the right moment after all. Something had shifted irrevocably in the space between them, and there would be no going back to serving coffee in the shadows. Evelyn straightened, picking up her serving tray with deliberate calm. She'd said what needed to be said, planted the seeds that would either grow into opportunity or strangle her completely. "Gentlemen, I should get back to work. Your espressos are getting cold." The casual dismissal was perfectly calculated. She wasn't running away, in fear, wasn't begging for their attention or approval. She was simply choosing to end the conversation on her terms, leaving them to wrestle with the implications of what they'd just heard. Nathaniel's hand moved almost imperceptibly, as if he wanted to reach out and stop her from walking away, but he caught himself. The gesture wasn't lost on Evelyn, who filed it away as evidence that she genuinely rattled the man who thought he owned every room he entered. As she moved toward the next table, Evelyn could feel Nathaniel's gaze burning into her back like a laser. She knew he would be back. Men like him couldn't resist a puzzle, especially one that might threaten their carefully constructed empires. The question was whether his return would bring opportunity or destruction, and whether she was strong enough to survive either outcome. Her hands remained steady as she served the next customer, but inside her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. After 2 years of silence, she'd finally spoken her truth, and now all she could do was wait to see if the world would listen or try to destroy her, all over again. 3 days passed before Nathaniel Cross returned to Meridian Cafe. But Evelyn had been counting each morning's first coffee tasting of nerves and anticipation she couldn't quite shake. When he finally appeared on Thursday morning, he came alone. No entourage of sycophants, no audience for his usual performance of casual cruelty. He chose a corner table, ordered a simple black coffee, and waited with the patience of a predator who knew his prey would eventually have to approach. Evelyn finished serving her current customers before walking over, her expression carefully neutral, despite the way tension had settled between her shoulder blades like a familiar weight. "Mr. Cross," she said, setting down his coffee with the same professional precision she used for every customer. "I wasn't sure we'd see you again after your last visit." Her tone was polite but distant, giving nothing away about the sleepless nights she'd spent wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Nathaniel studied her face with those sharp gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed armor, his voice carrying that clean, deliberate calm of a man who rarely second-guessed himself. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, stripped of the mockery that had characterized their first encounter. "About what you said regarding my Pentagon meeting and the trading patterns. You were right, by the way. Someone from the SEC's preliminary review team reached out yesterday." He delivered this information with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. But Evelyn caught the slight tightness around his eyes that suggested the call had been anything but routine. She felt a small surge of vindication mixed with concern. Being right about insider trading violations was satisfying, but it also meant she'd just proven herself capable of dismantling powerful men with nothing more than publicly available information. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied, though they both knew she wasn't sorry at all. "I hope it works out for you." The polite fiction hung between them like smoke, and Nathaniel's mouth quivered in what might have been amusement or respect. "I have a proposition for you," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to making offers that couldn't be refused. "I need someone to review my company's financial position before we go public with our next major acquisition. Someone who can spot problems before they become catastrophes." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Someone who can see what others miss." Evelyn kept her expression carefully blank, but inside her mind was racing through the implications. A consulting opportunity with Cross Industries would be worth more than she made in 6 months at the cafe. But it would also mean stepping back into the world that had chewed her up and spat her out once before. "That's a generous offer," she said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of work anymore." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. They both knew she was exactly the right person, which was precisely why the offer was balanced on a blade between redemption and ruin. His gaze weighed her like an equation whose solution he already suspected. Evelyn Harper. He said her name carrying more weight than it had in years. Former senior analyst at Goldman Sachs, specializing in tech sector acquisitions and regulatory compliance. You worked on the Meridian-Blackstone merger in 2019, the largest tech acquisition of that year. Each fact hit her like a physical blow, precise and devastating in its accuracy. He'd pulled the fragments from archived compliance databases and old investor filings, reconstructing her professional ghost from corporate memory that conveniently forgot quiet departures. You left Goldman under circumstances that were never fully explained to the public. And since then, you've been effectively invisible to the financial world. His voice softened slightly, but his gaze remained sharp. The question is, why someone with your talents is serving coffee instead of running companies? The familiar ache of old wounds being reopened settled in Evelyn's chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Sometimes talented people make mistakes," she said, the words carrying years of carefully suppressed pain. "Sometimes the financial world decides you're not worth the risk." She could see the curiosity blazing in Nathaniel's eyes, the desire to dig deeper to understand the mystery she represented. But she also caught something else, a flicker of recognition that suggested he understood what it felt like to be underestimated, to have your worth questioned by people who should know better. Her departure had made no headlines, just a silent disappearance through internal restructuring, the kind corporate memory conveniently forgets. "What makes you think I won't make the same mistakes again?" she asked, testing whether he was simply collecting talent or genuinely believed in her capabilities despite whatever he'd discovered about her past. "Because mistakes make people careful," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. "And careful people see details that overconfident ones miss. You spotted my EEC violation from across a cafe while carrying a serving tray. Imagine what you could find if you actually had access to our books." Fear and fascination coiled together, indistinguishable, as the offer hung in the air between them. Evelyn knew she should walk away, should stick to the safe invisibility she'd cultivated over the past 2 years. But the part of her that had once thrived in the high-stakes world of corporate finance was awakening from its forced hibernation, stretching muscles she'd thought were permanently atrophied. "This isn't charity," Nathaniel continued, correctly reading her hesitation. I'm not offering this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because I need someone who can think like you do, who can see what others miss. My company is about to make some very expensive decisions, and I can't afford to have them blow up in my face." The honesty in his voice was more compelling than any amount of money could have been. Evelyn realized that for the first time in years, someone was valuing her for her mind rather than pitying her for her circumstances. "What kind of acquisition?" she found herself asking, despite every instinct screaming at her to decline and return to the safety of her invisible life. The question was out before she could stop it, revealing that he'd already succeeded in hooking her interest. Nathaniel's smile was sharp and knowing. "Defense technology. A company called Pinnacle Systems that's developed some revolutionary encryption software. The Pentagon wants it, but there are 3 other bidders, and the due diligence process is more complicated than usual." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. The kind of deal where missing a single detail could cost hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially compromise national security. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken as the familiar thrill of a complex challenge began to override her caution. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes, multi-layered transaction that had made her reputation at Goldman Sachs, the kind of deal where her particular combination of technical knowledge and pattern recognition could make the difference between triumph and disaster. But it was also exactly the kind of opportunity that had led to her downfall before, when trust had been weaponized against her and competence had been twisted into culpability. "I'd need complete access to your financial records," she heard herself saying, the analyst already beginning to assess the scope of the project. "Not just the sanitized summaries you show investors, but the real numbers. Every subsidiary, every offshore account, every regulatory filing for the past 3 years." "Done," Nathaniel replied immediately, and the speed of his agreement told her that he'd expected this demand and was prepared to meet it. "You'd work directly with me, report to no one else, and have whatever resources you need to do the job properly." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "But I need your answer now, Evelyn. The other bidders aren't waiting for us to get our house in order." The ultimatum was delivered without malice, but with the absolute certainty of someone who'd built his empire by making quick decisions and living with the consequences. Evelyn felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the recognition that this conversation would either resurrect her career or provide new ways for the world to destroy her. All over again. Evelyn's first morning at Cross Industries began with a security badge that granted her access to floors she'd only dreamed of reaching during her cafe days. Security had waved her through an order marked, "Urgent authorization from CEO." The glass and steel sanctuary of her temporary office overlooked the Manhattan skyline from the 42nd floor, feeling both familiar and foreign after 2 years of industrial coffee machines and sticky tables. She settled into the leather chair behind her desk with the muscle memory of someone returning home after a long exile. Nathaniel had been true to his word. 3 monitors displayed real-time access to Cross Industries' complete financial ecosystem, from the primary corporate accounts down to the most obscure subsidiary holdings. The data spread before her like a vast, intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the electric thrill of intellectual challenge coursing through her veins. The Pinnacle Systems acquisition file was a monster, over 2,000 pages of technical specifications, financial projections, regulatory requirements, and competitive analysis that would have taken most analysts weeks to digest properly. But Evelyn had always possessed an unusual gift for seeing patterns in chaos, her fingers moving across screens in continuous motion as she connected fragments of information across disparate databases. As she dove into the documentation, cross-referencing Pinnacle's patent applications with their revenue streams and mapping their key personnel against known industry connections, she began to see the outline of something that made her stomach clench with familiar unease. The numbers were almost too perfect, the growth trajectory almost too consistent, the regulatory compliance almost too seamless for a company supposedly on the cutting edge of defense technology. By noon, she'd identified 3 major red flags that should have been obvious to anyone conducting proper due diligence. Pinnacle's encryption patents were heavily dependent on algorithms developed by 2 researchers who'd left the company 6 months ago to join a Chinese tech firm. Their primary government contract was set to expire in 8 months, with no guarantee of renewal, despite projections that assumed continued funding through 2027. Most concerning, their core technology appeared to be built on open-source foundations that could potentially be replicated by competitors with sufficient resources and motivation. Any one of these issues would have been cause for serious concern. Together, they suggested that Cross Industries was about to pay premium prices for a company whose competitive advantages were far more fragile than advertised. The boardroom where Evelyn presented her findings commanded the 43rd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Manhattan skyline like a living photograph. The faint hum of air conditioning carried over the metallic tang of coffee and tension as 20 executives settled around a table that could have hosted a small United Nations assembly. Nathaniel sat at the head, flanked by his senior leadership team, while Evelyn stood at the presentation screen, feeling every inch the outsider despite her temporary insider status. She'd prepared her analysis with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made her Goldman Sachs's most requested analyst. But she was acutely aware that this audience had the power to validate her resurrection or confirm her permanent exile from the world she'd once dominated. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of a dozen pairs of skeptical eyes fixed upon her. "After reviewing the Pinnacle Systems acquisition proposal, I've identified several critical issues that require immediate attention." The first slide of her presentation hit the room like a bombshell. "Pinnacle's core encryption technology is fundamentally compromised," she stated, watching as several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "The departure of their lead researchers represents a catastrophic intellectual property leak that renders their primary competitive advantage obsolete within 12 to 18 months. She clicked to the next slide, displaying a complex flowchart that traced the company's key patents back to their original developers. Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Marcus Webb were responsible for 73% of Pinnacle's breakthrough innovations. Their current employment at Quantum Dynamics, a subsidiary of Chinese tech giant ByteStream, means that any technological advantage Pinnacle currently possesses will be neutralized before we can recoup our investment." The room had gone completely silent, and Evelyn could see the dawning realization on several faces that they'd been about to commit corporate suicide. Victoria Sinclair, Cross Industries' chief financial officer, was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp with barely concealed hostility. "That's quite an analysis from someone who's been on the job for exactly 6 hours, she said, her tone designed to undermine Evelyn's credibility, without directly challenging her facts. Evelyn recognized the classic maneuver: undermine the newcomer, protect the hierarchy. Perhaps if you'd taken more time to understand the nuances of defense contracting, you'd realize that personnel changes are routine in this sector. But Evelyn had faced down hostile executives before, and she recognized the desperation beneath Victoria's polished dismissal. "You're absolutely right that personnel changes are routine," she replied calmly, advancing to her next slide. "Which is why smart companies build intellectual property protections that survive individual departures. Pinnacle failed to do this." The data on the screen was devastating in its clarity. According to their own internal communications, which I accessed through their investor relations portal, Pinnacle's management knew about the researchers' departure plans 6 months before they left. Instead of implementing knowledge transfer protocols or developing retention strategies, they chose to downplay the significance of the departures to potential acquirers. Evelyn's voice carried the cold precision of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis. "This suggests either incompetent management or deliberate deception, neither of which makes for an attractive acquisition target." She could see Nathaniel leaning forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on her presentation with the intensity of someone who just realized he was about to dodge a very expensive bullet. Victoria's face had gone pale, whether from anger or recognition that she'd failed to catch these issues during her own review. Furthermore, Evelyn continued building momentum as she moved through her analysis. Pinnacle's government contracts are far more vulnerable than their projections suggest. The Department of Defense has been systematically reducing its dependence on single-source encryption providers following the SolarWinds breach. Their current contract includes termination clauses that could be triggered by any significant change in ownership or technical personnel. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Even the skyline beyond the glass felt suspended, the city holding its breath for her next sentence. In other words, the moment Cross Industries acquires Pinnacle, we risk losing the very government relationships that justify the acquisition price. The boardroom had transformed into a battlefield, with executives exchanging meaningful glances and whispered conversations as they processed the implications of her findings. Evelyn recognized the signs of a power structure under stress the moment when carefully constructed plans collided with inconvenient realities. But her most damning revelation was yet to come. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Pinnacle's core technology appears to be built on algorithms that were originally developed as open-source projects by MIT and Stanford researchers. The final slide displayed a side-by-side comparison of Pinnacle's encryption code with publicly available academic papers dating back 3 years. While they've made improvements and optimizations, the fundamental architecture is reproducible by any competent development team with access to the original research. This means that our proposed $800 million acquisition would essentially be purchasing marketing rights to technology that our competitors could develop independently for a fraction of the cost. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and barely controlled fury. "How long have our due diligence teams been working on this acquisition?" he asked, though the question was clearly directed at Victoria rather than Evelyn. 18 months, Victoria replied, her voice tight with defensiveness. "We've conducted extensive technical reviews, financial audits, and market analysis." The implied criticism of Evelyn's rapid assessment hung in the air like smoke, but it only served to highlight the magnitude of the oversight. 18 months of work by dozens of highly paid analysts, and a former Goldman Sachs analyst working alone for 6 hours had identified deal-breaking flaws that they'd missed completely. Then perhaps, Nathaniel said, his tone carrying the kind of controlled anger that preceded mass firings, "we need to reconsider our approach to due diligence." The meeting ended with Victoria storming out of the boardroom, her face flushed with humiliation and rage, while the other executives filed out in uncomfortable silence. Evelyn found herself alone with Nathaniel, who remained seated at the head of the table, staring out at the Manhattan skyline with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You just saved my company $800 million, he said finally, turning to face her with something that might have been respect, "and probably prevented a congressional investigation into defense contracting fraud." He stood and walked to the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. "I have to ask, how did you see all of this so quickly when my entire team missed it?" The question carried genuine curiosity rather than accusation, the tone of someone trying to understand a puzzle rather than assign blame. Evelyn gathered her presentation materials, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes distance provides clarity," she replied. "Your team has been living with this deal for 18 months, investing their reputations in its success. That kind of emotional investment can create blind spots." She paused, considering how much truth to reveal. "Also, I've seen this exact pattern before, companies that look perfect on paper until you dig beneath the surface and discover that the foundation is built on sand." The reference to her past was oblique but unmistakable, a hint at the experiences that had cost her everything but gave her the hard-earned wisdom to spot deception hiding behind impressive presentations. Nathaniel turned from the window, and she saw something in his expression that she hadn't expected, understanding tinged with what might have been sympathy. "Victoria's going to blame you for this," he said, the warning delivered with matter-of-fact certainty. "She's been championing this acquisition since its inception, and your analysis just made her look either incompetent or complicit." The threat was real, and immediate corporate politics could be more vicious than any battlefield, and Evelyn had just made a powerful enemy who'd have every incentive to destroy her before she could do more damage. "I know," Evelyn replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "But that doesn't change the fact that this acquisition would have been a disaster." The simple statement carried the weight of someone who'd learned to value truth over safety, competence over popularity. Nathaniel smiled. Not the predatory grin she'd seen at the cafe, but something warmer and more genuine. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't, which is why you're going to help me figure out what we should be buying instead." The attack came on a Friday morning, delivered through Victoria Sinclair's perfectly manicured fingers and wrapped in the kind of corporate politeness that made poison taste like honey. Evelyn was reviewing Cross Industries' subsidiary structures when her email chimed with a message marked, "Urgent background verification required." The subject line alone made her pulse steady instead of racing. She'd been expecting this moment since accepting Nathaniel's offer. The contents were far worse than she'd anticipated. Victoria had been thorough in her investigation, pulling together fragments of Evelyn's professional destruction with the precision of a prosecutor building a capital case. Her connections inside the Justice Department had proved all too willing to trade sealed files for favors. Bank records, internal Goldman Sachs, communications SEC, filing discrepancies, and most damaging of all, photographs from the Justice Department investigation that had never made it to public record, but had somehow found their way into Victoria's possession. The documentation painted a picture that was both accurate and devastating. Evelyn Harper, former rising star of Goldman Sachs, implicated in a securities fraud scheme that had cost investors over $200 million. The files showed her signature on transfer documents, her access logs to confidential client accounts, and her presence at meetings where illegal trades had been discussed and approved. What the files didn't show was the careful manipulation that had led to those signatures, the access codes that had been stolen from her computer, and the meetings where she'd been the only voice of dissent in a room full of men who'd already decided that someone had to take the fall. Victoria had assembled the perfect frame without the context that would have revealed the frame itself. Nathaniel's office door was closed when Evelyn arrived, but she could hear voices through the thick wood, Victoria's sharp tones cutting through what sounded like a heated discussion. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, her professional mask firmly in place, despite the way her hands trembled with barely suppressed rage. The scene that greeted her was exactly what she'd expected: Victoria standing beside Nathaniel's desk, with the papers laid in perfect rows, cold and surgical, while Nathaniel himself sat rigid in his chair, his expression unreadable as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. "I see you've received Victoria's research," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "I assume this is where you ask me to explain myself before security escorts me from the building." Victoria smoothed her jacket with deliberate precision, the small gesture somehow more menacing than any verbal attack. "I think the documents speak for themselves," she replied, her tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just delivered a killing blow. "Though I'm curious to hear how you plan to explain away $200 million in fraudulent trades that bear your electronic signature." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, and Evelyn could see the calculation in Nathaniel's eyes as he weighed the woman who'd just saved his company against the evidence suggesting she was a criminal. This was the inevitable collision between her past and present, between the person she'd been and the person she was trying to become. "The signatures are real," Evelyn said, her admission dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "But the manipulation began long before I realized what was happening." She watched Nathaniel's jaw tighten as her words seemed to confirm his worst fears. But she pressed on with the calm determination of someone who'd learned that the truth was the only weapon that couldn't be turned against you. "I did authorize those trades, attend those meetings, and access those accounts. Everything in Victoria's files is factually accurate. What those files don't show is that I was set up by the one person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate my access, my schedule, and my moral blind spots to create the perfect fall guy for a scheme I spent months trying to expose." The revelation shifted the atmosphere in the room like a sudden change in air pressure. Victoria's confident expression flickered with uncertainty, while Nathaniel leaned forward with the intensity of someone who just realized the story was more complicated than it appeared. "That's quite a convenient explanation," Victoria said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Do you have any proof of this alleged manipulation?" The question was designed to corner Evelyn, to force her to admit that her version of events was nothing more than the desperate lies of someone caught red-handed. But Evelyn had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, gathering fragments of evidence that individually meant nothing but together painted a picture of systematic betrayal. "Garrett Wade," Evelyn said, and watched Nathaniel's eyes widen with recognition. Senior Managing Director at Goldman Sachs, my mentor for 3 years, and the man I was engaged to marry when everything fell apart. The personal detail added weight to her revelation. This wasn't just professional betrayal, but the deepest kind of personal destruction. He had complete access to my work systems, knew my security protocols, and was present at every meeting where the fraudulent trades were discussed. More importantly, he was the only person who could have modified the transaction logs to make it appear that I'd initiated trades I was actually trying to block. She paused, letting the implications sink in. The Justice Department investigation was dropped because they couldn't find sufficient evidence of intent. But by then, it was too late. My reputation was destroyed. My engagement was over, and Garrett had been promoted to head of the securities division. Nathaniel's expression had shifted from suspicion to something approaching understanding, the look of someone who'd spent enough time in corporate warfare to recognize the patterns of institutional betrayal. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, his question carrying genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Why disappear instead of exposing him? The query touched the deepest wound Evelyn carried, the knowledge that she'd chosen exile over battle, safety over justice. She'd been young enough to believe that truth would eventually surface, naive enough to think that competence would overcome conspiracy. "Because I was 28 years old and he was 42, she replied, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Because he had 20 years of relationships and I had 3 years of results. Because when it came down to his word against mine, the institution chose to believe the man who fit their expectations rather than the woman who challenged them." Victoria had gone pale during Evelyn's explanation, the confidence draining from her features as she realized she'd walked into a much more complex situation than she'd anticipated. But she rallied with the desperation of someone whose own credibility was now on the line. "That's a touching story," she said, her voice sharp with defensive hostility. "But it doesn't change the fact that you were involved in securities fraud. Even if this Garrett Wade manipulated you, you still participated in illegal activities." The accusation was technically accurate but morally bankrupt, the kind of logic that blamed victims for being naive enough to trust the wrong people. Evelyn had heard variations of this argument for 2 years, each repetition like salt in a wound that refused to heal. "You're absolutely right," Evelyn replied, her calm agreement clearly not what Victoria had expected. "I was involved, and I take full responsibility for my naivety. I trusted someone I shouldn't have, ignored warning signs I should have recognized, and allowed my personal feelings to compromise my professional judgment." The admission was honest and complete, but it carried the dignity of someone who'd learned to own her mistakes without being destroyed by them. "The question isn't whether I made errors in judgment. I clearly did. The question is whether those errors disqualify me from recognizing similar patterns when I see them in others." She turned her full attention to Nathaniel, meeting his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who'd survived the worst that corporate betrayal could deliver. "I saved your company $800 million because I've seen this exact playbook before. I know what financial fraud looks like because I've been on the receiving end of it." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the low vibration of the city through the window glass. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, his sharp eyes moving between Evelyn and Victoria as he processed the competing narratives and their implications for his company. This was the moment of decision that would determine not just Evelyn's future, but the entire trajectory of the Cross Industries acquisition strategy. She could see him calculating the risks and benefits, weighing her proven analytical skills against the liability of her compromised past. "Victoria," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions, "I want you to verify every detail of this story. Contact our investigators, pull whatever records you need, and give me a complete picture of what happened at Goldman Sachs." Victoria's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment as she realized her ambush had backfired spectacularly. "Nathaniel, surely you can't be considering keeping her on after—" she began, but he cut her off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "What I'm considering," he replied, his tone cooling several degrees, "is why our due diligence team spent 18 months missing obvious problems that she identified in 6 hours, and whether the issue is competence or something more concerning." The implicit threat was clear. Victoria's attempt to destroy Evelyn had raised questions about her own performance and motivations. I want that report by Monday morning, and I want recommendations for how we can prevent this kind of oversight in the future." As Victoria gathered her documents and stalked from the office, her earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled fury, Evelyn found herself alone with Nathaniel for the second time in a week. But this encounter felt fundamentally different from their boardroom conversation. The careful professional distance had been stripped away, leaving them to confront the messy realities of trust and betrayal that no corporate handbook could address. "Are you going to fire me?" She asked the question direct and unvarnished. She'd learned that uncertainty was often more corrosive than bad news, and she needed to know where she stood before she could decide how to move forward. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the Manhattan skyline, as if the city might provide answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he said, finally turning to face her with an expression that seemed to peer directly into her soul. "Do you still have feelings for Garrett Wade? Any part of you that wants revenge, vindication, or closure that might compromise your judgment when it comes to Cross Industries?" The question was both more personal and more professional than she'd expected, cutting straight to the heart of whether her past would poison her future. Evelyn considered the question with the care it deserved, examining her own motivations with the same analytical precision she applied to financial documents. The hatred she'd once carried had transformed over 2 years of exile, hardening from raw emotion into something more useful, a precise instrument for recognizing patterns others couldn't see. "What I feel now isn't personal anymore," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "It's professional. I understand how these systems work, how institutional protection enables individual corruption, how competence can be weaponized against the competent. That knowledge makes me useful rather than dangerous because I can spot the patterns that others miss." She paused, making sure Nathaniel understood the distinction she was drawing. "My anger became my education, and my education is what saved your company $800 million. Something in Nathaniel's expression shifted, a subtle relaxation that suggested he'd found the answer he'd been looking for. "Victoria's investigation will either vindicate you or destroy you," he said, the observation delivered with matter-of-fact certainty. "If your story checks out, she'll have to admit that her ambush was based on incomplete information. If it doesn't..." He left the thread unfinished, but the implication was clear. "I know," Evelyn replied, surprised by how calm she felt in the face of potential professional annihilation. "But I'm tired of running from my past. If my story can't survive scrutiny, then maybe I don't deserve a second chance." Monday morning brought vindication in the form of a 50-page investigative report that landed on Nathaniel's desk with the weight of moral authority behind it. Victoria had pulled half the compliance division into weekend overtime, determined to deliver a report before dawn Monday. Their fact-checking had been thorough, interviewing former Goldman Sachs employees, reviewing Justice Department files, and reconstructing the timeline of events that had led to Evelyn's professional destruction. What they'd uncovered was even more damning than Evelyn's own account. Garrett Wade hadn't just manipulated one junior analyst, but had orchestrated a pattern of systematic fraud that spanned 3 years and involved at least 6 other unwitting accomplices. The investigation revealed that Evelyn had been the only person who'd consistently raised concerns about the trading irregularities, filing internal compliance reports that had been buried by senior management and writing memos that documented her growing suspicions about the scheme's true scope. The report painted a picture of institutional corruption that made Evelyn's downfall seem not just unjust, but inevitable. She'd been targeted for destruction precisely because her analytical skills and moral compass made her the greatest threat to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Goldman Sachs's power structure. Garrett Wade had used her trust and love as weapons against her, manipulating her access codes to authorize trades she opposed, and timing his betrayal to occur just as federal investigators began closing in on the scheme. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, transforming Evelyn from a suspected criminal into a proven victim of the kind of corporate malfeasance that made headlines and toppled governments. Nathaniel called her into his office that afternoon, the investigative report spread across his desk like a tactical briefing. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of someone who just realized he'd almost repeated history's mistakes. Not just for doubting your story, but for the entire system that made it possible for someone like Garrett Wade to destroy someone like you. The acknowledgement was more than Evelyn had dared hope for, not just personal vindication, but institutional recognition that the fault lay with the system rather than with her judgment. Victoria's team confirmed every detail of your account, and they uncovered evidence that suggests Wade's scheme was even more extensive than you realized. You weren't just a victim, you were the only person with the integrity to try to stop it. The validation was intoxicating in a way that Evelyn hadn't expected, flooding her system with emotions she'd kept locked away for 2 years. But alongside the relief came a darker realization: if Garrett Wade had continued his operations after her exile, how many other people had been destroyed in the years since her departure? How many other analysts had been manipulated into complicity? And how many investors had lost fortunes to schemes that she might have been able to prevent? If she'd fought back instead of disappearing, "He's still out there," she said, the observation carrying the weight of moral obligation. Still running schemes, still destroying lives, still protected by an institution that values stability over justice. Nathaniel's expression sharpened with the predatory focus of someone who'd just identified a target worthy of his full attention. "Not anymore," he replied, his voice carrying a cold certainty that made Evelyn's pulse quicken. "Victoria's investigation turned up something interesting. Garrett Wade left Goldman Sachs 18 months ago to start his own hedge fund, Phoenix Capital Management, specializing in defense sector investments." He leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "They're one of our competitors for the Pinnacle Systems acquisition, and according to our intelligence, they're the front runners." The revelation hit Evelyn like a physical blow, the recognition that her past and present were about to collide in ways she'd never anticipated. The implications were staggering in their complexity. Garrett Wade, the man who destroyed her career and stolen her future, was now positioned to profit from the same kind of defense sector corruption that had characterized his Goldman Sachs operations. Phoenix Capital's bid for Pinnacle Systems wasn't just business competition. It was a continuation of the same systematic fraud that had cost Evelyn everything, wrapped in a new corporate structure but driven by the same moral bankruptcy that had made Wade wealthy and powerful. "He's going to win," Evelyn said, the prediction delivered with the grim certainty of someone who'd watched Wade manipulate systems for 3 years. "He has the Pentagon connections, the regulatory relationships, and the institutional credibility to close the deal before anyone realizes what they're buying." But Nathaniel's smile carried the dangerous confidence of someone who just realized he held better cards than his opponents suspected. "Not if we expose him first," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled excitement that preceded corporate warfare. "Victoria's investigation didn't just vindicate you, it gave us a roadmap to Wade's current operations. If he's running the same playbook at Phoenix Capital that he used at Goldman Sachs, then we can predict his moves and counter them before he realizes he's under attack." The proposition was both thrilling and terrifying, offering Evelyn the chance for the vindication she'd never dared pursue, while simultaneously putting her directly in the crosshairs of the man who'd already destroyed her once. The next 3 weeks transformed Cross Industries' corporate intelligence unit into something resembling a war room, with Evelyn and Nathaniel working 18-hour days to map Phoenix Capital's operations and identify the vulnerabilities that could be exploited to expose Wade's scheme. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic corruption that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity: falsified due diligence reports, bribes disguised as consulting fees, regulatory compliance documents that bore no relationship to reality, and a network of shell companies designed to obscure the true ownership and financing of major defense contracts. Wade had essentially created a private intelligence operation that sold classified Pentagon procurement information to foreign bidders while simultaneously positioning Phoenix Capital to profit from the resulting market chaos. Evelyn's unique position as both victim and expert gave her insights that no outside investigator could have possessed. She knew Wade's operational patterns, his psychological weaknesses, and most importantly, his tendency to document his crimes in meticulous detail as insurance against potential betrayals by his accomplices. "He keeps records of everything," she explained to Nathaniel as they reviewed Phoenix Capital's corporate structure in his office late one Friday evening. Not because he's careless, but because he's paranoid. Every conversation, every payment, every regulatory filing, he documents it all as leverage against the people he's corrupting. The observation was based on bitter personal experience. Wade had used similar documentation to frame her for crimes she'd tried to prevent. The breakthrough came when Evelyn identified a pattern in Phoenix Capital's acquisition financing that matched the shell company structures Wade had used during his Goldman Sachs operations. He's using the same offshore banking networks. She realized her excitement palpable as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The same legal firms, the same regulatory loopholes, even the same account numbering systems. It's like he photocopied his old playbook and just changed the company names. The discovery provided them with a strategic advantage that was almost unfair in its completeness. They could predict Wade's moves because he was repeating patterns that Evelyn had spent 3 years learning to recognize. But their most devastating weapon was hiding in plain sight the annual Defense Industry Gala, where Phoenix Capital's Garrett Wade was scheduled to receive the prestigious Innovation in National Security Award for his contributions to defense sector modernization. The ceremony would be attended by 500 of the most powerful people in Washington and New York, including Pentagon officials, congressional leaders, and journalists from every major financial publication. It would be the perfect venue for a public revelation that would destroy Wade's reputation and expose the corruption that had made his success possible. He chose the perfect stage for his own destruction, Nathaniel observed with grim satisfaction. All we have to do is make sure the spotlight finds him. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Evelyn would attend the gala as Nathaniel's guest. His status as a defense sector board member ensured invitations that no background check could block. She would use her access to gather final evidence from Wade's laptop during the cocktail reception, while Nathaniel prepared to present their findings during the award ceremony itself, turning Wade's moment of triumph into his public humiliation. The strategy was dangerous. If they were discovered before they could present their evidence, Wade would have the opportunity to destroy them both using the same institutional protection that had made his crimes possible. But it was also their only chance to achieve the kind of public vindication that could not be buried by corporate politics or regulatory corruption. As the gala approached, Evelyn found herself experiencing an emotional complexity that she struggled to navigate. The prospect of confronting Wade after 2 years of exile was both terrifying and exhilarating, offering the possibility of closure while simultaneously threatening to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. "Are you ready for this?" Nathaniel asked during their final preparation meeting, his question encompassing not just the operational logistics, but the emotional reality of facing the man who'd stolen her future. "I have to be," Evelyn replied, her voice carrying the steady determination of someone who'd finally found a cause worth the risk. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about making sure he can't do to anyone else what he did to me." The night before the gala, as Evelyn sat in her apartment reviewing their evidence files one final time, she realized that her journey had come full circle in ways she'd never anticipated. 2 years ago, she'd been a broken woman serving coffee to people who'd forgotten she existed. Someone who'd learned to make herself invisible rather than risk further destruction. Now, she was about to step back onto the stage, where her destruction had occurred, armed with knowledge and allies that could finally balance the scales of justice. The woman who'd walked into Meridian Cafe that first morning had been hiding from her past, accepting invisibility as the price of safety. The woman who would attend tomorrow's gala was ready to reclaim her future, to transform from someone the system had broken into someone who could rewrite the system itself. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity and competence that no amount of institutional corruption could destroy, carrying the weight of everyone who'd been silenced by power and the responsibility of ensuring their voices would finally be heard. The Mandarin Oriental's grand ballroom had been transformed into a monument to defense industry power, with 500 of Washington and New York's most influential figures mingling beneath crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fractals across marble floors. Evelyn moved through the crowd in a black evening gown that Nathaniel had insisted on buying, her hair styled in a way that made her nearly unrecognizable from the waitress who'd served coffee 2 months earlier. She carried herself with the practiced confidence of someone who belonged in this world, but her fingertips tingled, every nerve tuned to the room's rhythm as she scanned for her target. Garrett Wade stood near the central bar, accepting congratulations from Pentagon officials and defense contractors who saw his Innovation in National Security award as validation of their own moral compromises. He looked exactly as Evelyn remembered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of charismatic authority that made people forget to ask uncomfortable questions about the source of his success. The sight of him triggered something complex. She saw him simultaneously through the lens of personal betrayal and professional analysis, her trained eye cataloging his behavioral patterns while her memory registered the familiar gestures that had once meant safety and love. "Remember," Nathaniel murmured as they approached the cocktail reception, his voice barely audible above the string quartet's rendition of classical standards. "We need the laptop access codes and the offshore account documentation. Everything else is secondary." His presence beside her was both reassuring and dangerous. If their plan failed, his reputation would be destroyed alongside hers. But he'd insisted on being here, claiming that moral courage required personal risk rather than delegation to others. The cocktail hour provided perfect cover for reconnaissance. Evelyn positioned herself near Wade's table, nursing a glass of champagne, while listening to conversations that revealed the scope of his current operations. Phoenix Capital wasn't just bidding on Pinnacle systems, they were orchestrating a comprehensive acquisition strategy that would give them control over multiple defense contractors simultaneously. The scheme was breathtaking in its audacity and scope, designed to create a monopoly over certain categories of military technology that could then be leveraged for maximum profit, regardless of national security implications. Wade's security was minimal. His arrogance had convinced him that exposure was impossible among an audience of complicit peers. His laptop sat unguarded on a side table during dinner, protected only by password encryption that Evelyn had learned to bypass during her Goldman Sachs years. She'd installed the exploit during a harmless test login days earlier, anticipating he'd bring the same machine. The breakthrough came when she recognized his behavioral patterns from their former relationship. Wade always used the same base password, modified with current dates and locations. Pinnacle 2024 Mandarin opened his system like a key turning in a familiar lock. The files she accessed were even more damning than their investigation had suggested. Phoenix Capital was essentially a front for foreign intelligence services, using American defense contractors as unwitting conduits for technology transfer to hostile nations. The laptop contained detailed records of payments from Chinese intelligence operatives, correspondence with Pentagon officials who'd been compromised through blackmail and bribery, and technical specifications for classified military systems that had been sold to the highest bidders regardless of their allegiances or intentions. But the most shocking discovery was personal. A folder labeled Insurance Policies contained detailed dossiers on dozens of analysts and compliance officers who'd been systematically destroyed using the same techniques Wade had employed against Evelyn. She wasn't his only victim. She was part of a pattern of institutional predation that had spanned decades and ruined hundreds of careers. The evidence transformed her quest for personal vindication into something larger and more urgent: the exposure of a criminal enterprise that threatened not just individual lives, but national security itself. The award ceremony began at 8 o'clock, with Wade scheduled to receive his honor during the evening's climactic presentation. Evelyn had uploaded his files to secure servers and transmitted copies to federal investigators, but the real impact would come from public exposure that couldn't be buried by institutional protection. Federal investigators stationed discreetly among guests were waiting for his signal. As Wade approached the podium to accept his award, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd successfully gamed every system designed to stop him. Nathaniel rose from their table with a folder of printed evidence in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathaniel's voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in rooms full of powerful people. "Before we celebrate Mr. Wade's contributions to national security, I believe you should see what those contributions actually entail." A coded phrase in his introduction triggered the federal signal team. The interruption sent ripples of confusion through the audience, but Nathaniel's reputation as a defense industry insider gave his words weight that couldn't be dismissed as publicity-seeking disruption. Wade's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to barely controlled panic as he realized that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble in front of everyone who mattered to his continued success. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose institutional protection was evaporating in real time. "Security should remove this man immediately." But the hotel security was under federal control, and the Pentagon officials in attendance were suddenly very interested in hearing what Nathaniel had to say about their award recipient. The presentation that followed was clinical in its precision and devastating in its impact. Nathaniel methodically outlined Phoenix Capital's foreign intelligence connections, their systematic corruption of Pentagon procurement processes, and their role in transferring classified military technology to hostile nations. Each revelation was supported by documentation from Wade's own laptop, making denial impossible and shifting the burden of proof from accusation to explanation. The audience sat in stunned silence as the scope of Wade's betrayal became undeniable. Evelyn watched from her table as Wade's carefully constructed world compressed into inevitability, his face cycling through rage, desperation, and finally the gray pallor of someone who just realized that all paths led to the same destination. The man who'd once destroyed her career with casual cruelty now stood exposed before hundreds of witnesses, his reputation shredded beyond any possibility of repair. The irony was almost too perfect. Wade had chosen this venue to celebrate his greatest triumph only to have it become the stage for his complete destruction. But the most satisfying moment came when Wade's gaze finally found Evelyn in the crowd, recognition flashing across his features as he understood who had orchestrated his downfall. The woman he dismissed as a naive idealist had become the architect of his professional annihilation, using the same analytical skills he'd tried to destroy to expose crimes he thought were perfectly hidden. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity till their eyes met across the ballroom, hers steady with the calm satisfaction of work, completed his eyes wide with the recognition that power had finally shifted to its proper place. She felt neither triumph nor mercy, only the quiet certainty that this was how justice looked when it finally functioned as designed. As Nathaniel concluded his presentation and federal agents began moving through the crowd to secure evidence and potential witnesses, Evelyn felt a complex mixture of clarity and exhaustion. The moment she'd planned for months was finally happening, but the reality was more procedural than dramatic. Justice moved like clockwork, mechanical, impersonal, unstoppable. Wade's destruction wouldn't undo the damage he'd caused to her or his other victims, but it would prevent him from creating new ones. The gala ended in chaos, with guests streaming toward exits while mirrored walls reflected flashing camera lights like fragments of scattered truth. Evelyn and Nathaniel slipped away quietly, their mission accomplished, but their real work just beginning. The evidence they'd gathered would fuel federal investigations for months, but the institutional changes needed to prevent future Garrett Wades would require sustained effort and political courage that couldn't be guaranteed. Still, as they walked through Manhattan's empty streets toward an uncertain but self-determined future, the night air carried the distant hum of sirens and the crisp promise of winter, matching the stillness that had settled in her chest, not the peace of endings, but the calm of someone who'd finally balanced the scales. The FBI arrived at the Defense Industry Gala exactly 17 minutes after Nathaniel's presentation concluded, their black sedans pulling up to the Mandarin Oriental's circular drive, like a funeral procession for Garrett Wade's career. The operation had been coordinated with the Justice Department's Financial Crimes Division weeks earlier. Evelyn watched from the hotel's marble lobby as federal agents moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, their badges catching the light from crystal chandeliers. Wade had tried to leave during the chaos, but hotel security had quietly sealed the exits. He was trapped among chandeliers and marble, every exit mirrored in gold he couldn't buy his way through. Agent Sarah Martinez approached Wade with federal warrants in hand. "Mr. Wade, you're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act." The charges carried the weight of federal authority that no amount of wealth could challenge. Wade's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, the gray pallor of someone whose carefully constructed defenses had crumbled. "This is a setup," he said, pointing at Evelyn. "She's obsessed with destroying me." Martinez cut him off with professional dismissal as the handcuffs clicked into place. The ballroom transformed into a crime scene with federal agents interviewing witnesses while camera flashes pulsed against glass walls. The Innovation in National Security Award Wade was to receive lay abandoned on the podium. Pentagon officials huddled with legal counsel while congressional leaders fielded calls from reporters. The institutional protection that had once made Wade untouchable now worked against him as every organization sought distance from the scandal. 3 days later, Goldman Sachs issued a public statement acknowledging their role in Evelyn's wrongful termination and announcing a comprehensive review of internal compliance procedures. Goldman Sachs recognizes that our internal processes failed to protect a valued employee who was attempting to expose serious regulatory violations. The statement read, "The formal apology came with a settlement offer that would have made Evelyn wealthy, but she declined. I don't want their money," she told her lawyer. "I want them to admit that intellect should be valued over influence, that truth should matter more than institutional comfort." Victoria Sinclair's downfall was quieter but complete. Cross Industries' investigation revealed she'd shared confidential information with Phoenix Capital in exchange for promises of future employment. Metadata from encrypted calls traced directly to Phoenix Capital's network. Nathaniel terminated her employment within hours, her 20-year career ending with the same abrupt finality that had characterized Evelyn's departure from Goldman Sachs. The regulatory response was swift new SEC oversight requirements for defense investments, stricter Pentagon conflict of interest policies, and a Justice Department task force for financial crimes with national security implications. The reforms were largely symbolic, but they represented acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed stronger safeguards. Job offers poured in from investment banks, consulting firms, and government agencies. The Financial Times profiled her as the analyst who brought down Phoenix Capital. Harvard Business School invited her to speak about corporate ethics. But the most meaningful recognition came from former colleagues who reached out with apologies, junior analysts inspired to speak up about irregularities, and compliance officers who cited her investigation as proof that individual integrity could overcome institutional corruption. 3 months after Garrett Wade's conviction, Evelyn stood in the empty office space that would house Harper Financial Analytics, her new consulting firm. The 20th floor Manhattan space offered panoramic views of the city that had both destroyed and rebuilt her. This time she was looking as an owner rather than an employee, someone who'd chosen her own path. Nathaniel had offered her a permanent position as Cross Industries' chief risk officer with a substantial salary. "You could write your own ticket anywhere," he'd argued. "Why risk everything on a startup when you could have guaranteed success?" Her answer was simple. "Those institutions haven't actually changed. If I want to build something that protects people, I need to build it outside the existing power structure." Harper Financial Analytics would offer uncompromising analysis that prioritized truth over client comfort, competence over institutional relationships. The firm's initial capital came from a consulting retainer Nathaniel insisted on paying in advance. Her first client was Elena Rodriguez, CEO of Meridian Defense Systems, targeted for acquisition by a private equity firm with questionable financing. Evelyn's investigation revealed a national security operation disguised as investment, preventing Rodriguez's company from becoming part of an espionage network that could have compromised American military capabilities. 6 months later, Harper Financial Analytics had grown to 12 analysts and compliance specialists who shared Evelyn's commitment to integrity. The client base included technology companies, defense contractors, and government agencies needing thorough analysis that larger firms couldn't provide. Each case reinforced her belief that there was a market for truth in an industry built on comfortable lies. The most meaningful aspect wasn't the financial success, but the letters from junior analysts, compliance officers, and whistleblowers inspired by her story. "You prove that competence can overcome corruption if you're willing to fight for what's right," wrote one forensic accountant who'd exposed embezzlement after reading about Evelyn's investigation. Her relationship with Nathaniel had evolved from professional respect into genuine partnership. He'd become Harper Financial's first major client, but their connection grew beyond business. "You changed how I think about corporate responsibility," he told her. Not just legal requirements, but the moral obligation to use power responsibly. Their romantic relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect rather than the passion that had made her vulnerable to Wade's manipulation. On the first anniversary of Wade's conviction, Evelyn returned to Meridian Cafe as a customer meeting a potential client. The smell of roasted beans hit her like a memory made tangible. Miguel, her former co-worker, smiled with genuine warmth. "I always knew you were too smart to be working here forever." The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd once served coffee to people who ignored her was now courted by executives competing for her expertise. As she walked through Manhattan's financial district after the meeting, the same streets that once ignored her now reflected her transformation. Harper Financial Analytics represented more than a business. It was a platform for institutional reform that could only come from outside existing power structures. Every case, every fraud exposed, every whistleblower protected represented a small victory against the corruption that had nearly destroyed her, but ultimately became her greatest strength. The woman who'd been silenced by institutional power had found her voice and intended to use it to ensure others would never experience the systematic betrayal that had cost her everything and taught her the true value of justice.